Okay, so this story may be a little different, but nonetheless, I thought you might be interested in hearing it, so here it goes. I moved into a new home in 2021. It was a nice little house, but it was perfect for me. It was a two-bedroom with a full basement and attached garage, which was pretty much perfect for me and what I needed. It was also my first owned home, as I was previously renting a house, but it wasn't working out with the owners. You see, I foster dogs, and when I moved into the last place, I told the owners this to make sure they were okay with it. But then, after 2 years there, they told me I either had to get rid of the dogs or move out. Obviously, I chose my dogs. I was pretty excited about my new place because I was planning on renovating the whole garage to be their little dog haven. They would have access to the house, of course, but they would also have their dog beds, toys, food, and entertainment in there. Some dogs I rescued came from bad environments, and sometimes they would rather have their own safe space, and I respected that. They deserved it. But anyways, I'm getting a little off topic. So my new home was going to open a lot of doors for me and my dogs, so everything was looking good. When I started moving in, I had the normal neighbors watching from their porch, or the kids staring as they rode past my house on their bikes. Nothing too remarkable. But since I did have a lot of stuff and large equipment, it took me a few days to move in. I even had a few friends and a coworker helping me late one night. It was one of the moments of, I'm tired of moving, I got my second win, and I just wanted it to be done already. So, I gathered up who I could with promises of free beer and food, and we finally finished at about 2 o'clock in the morning. While we sat in my living room relaxing for the rest of the night, I had someone knocking on my door. To my surprise, it was a cop. He said he was there due to a reported disturbance. I was confused, wondering if maybe they had the wrong house, but I allowed him inside and explained that I had just finished moving in. I think after he saw all of us in the living room sitting around with drinks and controllers, he understood what had happened. He just reminded me to be aware of the amount of noise we were making considering the time, and I apologized and assured him that it wouldn't happen again. We continued on with our night, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious who called the cops on us. I know we were laughing and talking pretty loud, but I didn't think we were that loud. But I digress. Over time, I noticed several of my neighbors being very watchful. Sometimes when I would get my mail, the older lady next door to me would be getting hers too. But when I approached, she would quickly gather her mail, stop sifting through it, and swiftly walk back to her house. But she wouldn't go inside. She stood near her trash bin, trying to act like she was looking it over or adjusting it, but I think I caught her off guard because I could see her staring at me. When we finally made eye contact, she immediately ran off into her house. I thought it was weird, but ultimately just chalked it up to her being that cliché old lady. She's probably lived there for decades, didn't like new people, not to mention I'm sure I looked pretty intimidating. But I let it go. I didn't need to make friends with my neighbors and have everyone like me, especially if they just left me alone, then I didn't care. But she wouldn't be the only person to stare at me. While mowing the yard one Sunday, I started feeling watched. I looked around and noticed the two kids standing with their bikes near the road in front of my place, watching me. I waved at them, and without as much as a returned wave or smile, they got on their bikes and rode off. As I watched them ride away, I saw the couple standing on the porch across the street also staring at me. The woman was on the phone and kept pointing towards my place and talking with her hands. The guy stood on the steps with his arms crossing his chest, and he looked pissed off as he stared at me too. I didn't know what the deal was over there, but I didn't like the idea of them staring and pointing at me. I tried to rush through mowing so I could just go back inside. As I walked to the shed to put my mower away, I noticed the couple on the other side was in their backyard, and the man was trying to look over the fence into my yard. I didn't understand why I seemed to be so interesting to these people, but I was honestly quite annoyed. I greeted the man saying something like, "Hey, how's it going?" I seemed to have startled him as he immediately walked away. He yelled something to his wife, and both of them scurried away inside. And stuff like that continued to happen for weeks. I would come home, and someone would come outside and watch me. If it was during the day, some of them would go inside, and I even heard the people across the street call their kids inside, who had been playing in the yard. I was starting to think that something was going on that I wasn't aware of. Was this going to be a regular thing for me? I finally got the freedom to do what I wanted in my own home, and my neighbors were going to make me feel like I was locked in some kind of prison, constantly being watched? Then, I finally had my chance to try and confront the situation head on. On my day off, I decided to hit up a coffee shop to get my day started. As I waited for my coffee, I noticed one of my neighbors sitting at a table nearby, staring intently at his tablet. This was the only person in the neighborhood that had ever really tried to talk to me. He usually kept to himself, but if he was outside when I drove by or was walking one of the dogs, he would wave to me. I've also seen him at this coffee shop a few times, and we would just smile and nod at each other. He never tried to avoid me, and so I thought maybe I would have a shot at clearing some things up with him. I approached and greeted him, and after asking how he was, he offered me to sit with him. After a little small talk, I slipped in how the neighborhood seems to keep tabs on everyone else. He laughed and made a comment about how they're not very subtle about it, which is why he kept to himself too. I asked him what he meant by that, and he said nonchalantly, "I think they're just afraid of you." Then he started laughing. I was confused. Why would they be afraid of me? Like I mentioned, I may look kind of scary, I guess. I'm a bigger guy. I'm bald and I have full tattoo sleeves on both arms, but I don't try to pretend to be tough or intimidating. The only time I need to do that is at work because I work security at a pretty high-level office building. So I asked the old man if that's what he meant. He shrugged and said that it was probably because people were cooped up inside and had nothing better to do with their time but make things up. It was nice to talk to him, because I've learned that he reminded me a lot of myself. He was honest and blunt, even if it wasn't what you wanted to hear, and I appreciated that. But after learning this, I didn't know how to react and what to do. Am I supposed to go door to door and tell these people about myself? Do I put up a sign that says, "I'm not mean"? Was I supposed to just live with people thinking I was a blemish on their community? At the time, that's really all I could do. I told myself that either their gossip would die or I would get to settle the rumors when I had the time. It was only a few days later that I decided to take one of my more skittish dogs for a walk to give him some one-on-one time. I walked by the old man's house, Neil, as I came to learn, and he was outside, talking to the woman that lived across from me, the one that I saw talking on the phone. She was standing by a kid who was holding a booklet. Neil called out to me by name, so I looked over and waved. But then he motioned for me to come over. I wasn't planning on interacting with others, so I didn't have a mask on me at the time, so I was hesitant to approach as those three did have one on. Even though their face was covered, I could see the look of disappointment from the woman, and she pulled the kid in closer to her. I reluctantly approached and used my shirt to cover my face, apologizing for not having a mask on me. Neil waved me off, saying I was fine, as they all did, and then he immediately introduced me to the woman. He confirmed that she lived across from me, and in his fashion, he said, "Clayton said he thinks people don't like him. Have you heard about that, Sarah? I watched as the color drained from her face. I couldn't help but laugh to cover up the awkward situation. She tried to deny it, so Neil laughed and then turned to me and asked about me. He asked what I did for a living, and I explained that I worked in security, and briefly explained where it was, as it wasn't too far from home, maybe 10 to 12 miles. I also explained that I worked overnights, which is why I left late at night, came home early, and wasn't typically seen during the day, because I may be asleep or taking care of my dogs. He then asked me about my dog, and the kid asked if he could pet him. I told him he could, as he was friendly, and then explained that I fostered dogs. That's when Sarah asked, "Do people adopt them from your place too?" I confirmed, and I explained that I had people over during the day to look at the dogs and possibly adopt them. Her face changed to one of understanding, like something finally made sense to her. It was finally making sense to me. These people saw me at weird hours. They saw people coming and going, and probably heard odd sounds too because of me working in the garage. Maybe some of the dogs that whimpered and cried because some of them hated baths, who knows. But I started to see what Neil was doing. He never confirmed, but I assumed that he learned some of the things people were saying, and that's why he brought those up specifically. Sarah loosened up tremendously as we talked, and probably even more when the kid asked me if I wanted to help his school fundraiser, and I agreed to. He was selling candy bars, and chocolate is my weakness, so I bought a whale box. I think I became that kid's best friend that day. Anyways, after chatting for a few minutes, I excused myself and then waved goodbye. I went home that night feeling some sort of way. I was happy to talk to someone other than Neil and clear things up, but at the same time, I felt kind of crappy that there probably were rumors about me. But when I talked to my mom about it, she made a good point. She pointed out that I was looking like the creepy and suspicious neighbor. I was, in fact, the creepy neighbor for everyone else, and that made me laugh. I still live in the same place, and now the kids come by to play with the dogs, which is great. It gives them the chance to get out a lot of energy, and they never miss my place when they have some kind of fundraiser. It's become a much better place to live knowing your neighbors are behind you. Even the old lady next to me, Marcia, seems to keep her distance, but she doesn't mind it when I shovel her driveway or mow her yard. So, yeah. That's my story of the tables being turned, and how, for a little while, I was the creepy neighbor. Hi, Raven. I've been listening to you for a few months now. As many have said, I appreciate that there is a safe space for individuals to share their experiences. There are some experiences about dreams and coincidences that you've shared on your podcast that made my heart race, because I've had some weird happenings myself. Whether you would like to share this or not, I'm happy that you're reading this. For some context, I am of Hmong descent, where our traditional belief is shamanism. In our culture, there are some individuals that are born to become shamans. They are visited in their dreams by guides and chosen to help bring healing to our community, whether it's through readings, blessings, ceremonies, etc. To add, I've always had vivid dreams as a child, both good and bad. Dreams of flying and visiting people. I would also have weird coincidences where I would dream that someone would get hurt, and then as time passes, they would find themselves injured. Now you can say, well, everyone gets injured to some extent, but the kind of injury I'm explaining is like a major illness or death. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, I wake up in a cold sweat. It feels like I'm having a panic attack, and it takes me a bit to calm down. But for that entire day, I'd be riddled with intense thoughts of the person or people involved. it only goes away if I tell someone. This specific kind of dream has only happened 5 times. And my mom and I nicknamed those dreams, well, those dreams. As a child, I had dreams of flying and would love to talk to my parents about it. But it was pushed to the side as crazy talk or wild imagination. I stopped talking about them for a while, but it was only until I had the first of those dreams where my mom and I knew this might be something different. I don't recall how old I was, but it was when I was still living in my childhood home from around 1995 to 2005. From birth until maybe 11 or 12 years old, I think. This home was very old. It was an old red brick Victorian home with wooden creaky floors, air vents that a child could crawl into, a laundry chute from the second floor down to the basement, huge locks on the bedroom doors where we could use the skeleton key to open, or the spoon if you were crafty like me, and a horrible unfinished cement basement with far too many closets. Yeah, it was an old place. When I was a child, my grandfather suffered from a stroke and was paralyzed from the waist down, thus was wheelchair bound. Due to this, he and my grandmother lived on the bottom level of our home, while my family and I were upstairs. I was very close to my grandparents. I'm a first-generation Hmong American, and my parents had me when they were teenagers. They spent a lot of their time working while my grandparents raised me. With the grandparents living at my house, we often had relatives visiting. It was one of the nights when some of the cousins were over and we ended up having a sleepover. We had a blast eating junk food and playing hide and seek. Hide and seek was one of our favorite games to play because my house was huge, and there were so many places to hide. As an adult, I shake my head at myself for even going to hide in some of the creepy places I did as a child, so I blame myself for the scary experiences that I had. Anyways, this night was different. I should have known that something was off, but as a child I didn't think too far into it. After a fun-filled day, we all decided to bring the couch cushions into my room to make a fort with my mattress and blankets. Once we were successful, we decided on the sleeping order and ended up where I had to sleep by the vent because it was my house. The vents were scary because you could hear noises coming up from them if people were moving throughout the house. We stayed up for a bit and played Barbies, but while playing I could faintly hear something coming from the vent in my room. As the other girls were playing, I zoned in on the sound and it sounded like tapping and slow breathing. I got goosebumps right away. It was around 10 p.m. on a weekend. My parents were out with their friends and my grandparents were asleep downstairs, and not the type to be up and about so late at night. Who could be around at this time? Assuming it was my grandma probably using the bathroom, I let it be and continued to play with my cousins. That night is when I had the dream. I dreamt that I was outside with my cousins during the day, playing outside like regular kids, when I turned to my left and saw a man in sunglasses down the block walking towards us. I could see that the skin on his face looked like it was melted. It almost looked like third-degree burns that didn't heal properly, except the skin was shiny. He had black hair, or maybe a black hat on. He wore a red shirt and sunglasses. I couldn't make out the bottom portion of him, but in that moment, I just knew that he was staring directly at me. Maybe it's because his head turned ever so slightly. It's like he saw me, or maybe I saw him. As he walked on the sidewalk towards us, I felt a sense of foreboding. When we locked eyes, I remembered the color and lights around him glowing bright. So bright it was like the world was shaking around him, and that's when I broke eye contact and turned to my cousins to tell them to get inside the house. I herded them up and pushed them inside the front door, reaching for the screen door. There was a lock on the side of the handle that I felt for once I had it closed. I knew that if I locked it, then it might delay that thing from getting into the house, as I made sure to hide everyone. But the lock didn't work. I moved the little black lock up and down while repeatedly opening and shutting the door, but I could not get it to lock. So I just pulled it shut and slammed the heavy wooden door closed instead. I bolted the top and bottom and looked up. The door had a small window at the top that was usually covered in a small makeshift curtain my grandma made for privacy, but it wasn't there. On the other side of the window, I saw the face of a man. I'm not sure how tall that entity was, but he must have been tall. I don't remember a mouth or any features besides his sunglasses, black hair, and hat. I backed away quickly as I saw the white screen door open, but open through him. Then I heard the doorknob start shaking as the door started to rattle. At this point, I wasn't thinking about my cousins anymore. I was thinking about where to hide. I felt like I was too late, but too late for what, exactly? I don't know. At the end of the hall across from the front door is the door that leads to the lower level of where my grandparents stay. I backed up all the way until my back was against the door, and then I opened it and ran in. I slammed the door behind me and locked it as well. Anything to get me away from whatever was coming towards me. At this point, I knew that thing was on the other side. It got in so easily and quickly. I remember screaming in my head. I was afraid to let go of the knob, but I did, and sprinted into my grandfather's room, hiding in his bed. As I hid, the man burst in the room, and then I felt like I blacked out. Blacking out in my dream resulted in me waking up in what felt like a panic attack. I remember waking up and crying to my cousins. I told them exactly as I told you. I was petrified of whoever or whatever that man was. My cousins urged me to tell my parents, but I was afraid that they would call me crazy again, but I did. I told my parents that something bad might happen, but I don't know what, and I couldn't tell them who. As a kid, I just knew something bad was going to happen in this house, and I couldn't stop it. I remember telling my mom specifically that. And then, maybe what felt like months later, my grandfather passed in his bed during the day. My grandpa passed away in October of 2001. My family and I could never shake the eerie feeling that the dream could have been a warning or a sign. Granted, we are very superstitious, though. Many relatives have their theories, but the most common theory is that one day, I may need to become a shaman. Some believe it was a vision, and some believe I have an attachment. This is only due to the happenings that occurred after my grandfather's death. I personally don't know what to believe. Paranormal experiences used to be a daily occurrence for my siblings and I growing up after my grandpa passed away, until everything came to a stop when a shaman got involved. I can't explain the feeling, but it's like a veil was put over us. Things are there, but they're not. My siblings and I talk about it all the time now that we're adults. There are so many stories that I can share if you're interested. From creepy hauntings to having a coworker turn into a believer. Currently, I'm about to take the step in finally seeking out a traditional shaman to speak to my spirit. The most recent of those dreams, last year, 2023, resulted in me having to go to the ER from internal bleeding I got while sleeping. I won't go into detail in this, for I fear that it will make it too long, but long story short, I was stabbed in my stomach. To this day, even my doctor has no idea what could have caused it at 5 a.m. in my sleep. They've written it off as something that happens, after telling me that a bleed like that does not just happen. I'm 29 years old, with no known medical history on what would cause internal bleeding like that. Of course, I didn't tell them about my dream because it would sound crazy, but my mom thinks that whatever could have been bothering me over the years may be back. I'll also include that she was raised Mormon and married into shamanism, so she was a heavy skeptic on the shaman beliefs in the past. Thank you for your time, and thank you so much for allowing me to finally be able to share this story without feeling so alone. I hope that others who are also going through a time in their life where they are unsure about themselves and why things are happening know that they are not alone. I'm sending everyone so much love and support. Best wishes. I finally got the chance to write out something that happened to me when I was a young adult. This was back in the late 90s, when I was working as a tow truck driver. I worked on call on the overnight shift, and after finishing a job, I stopped at a gas station to fill up so I wouldn't have to worry about it if I did get a call in the middle of the night. Better to do it around midnight rather than 3 in the morning when you just want to get back home and back in bed. I remember it was autumn because it was a lot cooler, so I could have my windows down comfortably all night. I pulled into the gas station, one that I had stopped at plenty of times before. The parking lot was pretty empty, and there was a car parked on the side of the gas station building that was off. My first thought was that it was either someone that worked there or maybe someone else that stopped for something other than gas. I didn't pay any more attention than that. But as I started fueling up, I heard a very loud pop coming from the store. It made me jump, and I looked over to see if I could figure out what it was. But all I saw was a man in a mask jumping over the counter and running out the door. I remember being frozen in place. I didn't know if I should go in and check on those in there, or if I should hide, or hell, if I should just leave and save myself. But before I could even make a choice, the man in the mask noticed me and we made eye contact. He quickly approached me, raising the gun, and asked me, "What did you see?" I kept my hands up and my head to the ground and said, "Nothing. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything." We stayed like this for a few seconds, until he shoved me and said, "Get back in your truck and leave, now." As I walked back to my truck, he shouted at me to hurry up, so I started the truck and left before I even got my seatbelt on. I watched from the mirror as he stood in the parking lot watching me until I was completely out of view. I know I got out of there unscathed, but it kept eating at me. What if he had shot someone at the station? What if they were dead or dying and no one was there to help? Would anyone show up there to help? So I made a pretty crazy decision and headed back. I didn't have a cell phone at the time, but I did have my radio in the truck. I immediately called it in and told them that I think I witnessed a robbery, and told them to get the police there as soon as possible. Then I turned around to head back. When I got back, the car on the side was gone, assuming it was the robbers, so I pulled in and waited before getting out to make sure no one ran up to my truck. When no one came up, I quickly jumped out and ran into the station. I saw just what I was worried about. The old man that owned the place was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, with a bullet wound in his stomach. And then there was a younger girl laying next to him, her face bruised and cut. Both of them were unconscious. I knew it probably wasn't that long, but the police hadn't arrived yet, so I grabbed the wall phone behind the counter and called 911. While on the phone, the lady said they already had someone on the way, but asked for the status of the victims. She asked me to apply pressure to the wounds on the man to prevent further bleeding. Thankfully, it wasn't long before an ambulance showed up, followed by the police. They got the man in the ambulance and left pretty quickly, while another group worked on the girl. While I was talking to the police outside, they wheeled the girl out, who was now awake but still looked rough. I explained to the cops what all I had witnessed, and one of them thanked me for radioing it in. They explained that the man had lost a lot of blood, and since the girl hadn't woken up, he could have died if I hadn't. That's when I knew that I did the right thing, even if it could have cost me my life. After giving them my contact information, I was told that I could leave. I went home to my wife and kids, still a bit shaken up, and explained to my wife what had happened. She was usually asleep when I left, but she said that she woke up to a bad feeling when I hadn't returned within the normal amount of time. She called the office to ask about me, and they had said they hadn't heard from me yet. I would actually end up radioing into them right after she called. After talking through it, she said that she was proud of me for going back and calling it in, even if it was risky, knowing that she would want someone to do the same for her if she was the victim. We were both up for another hour or so before we finally fell back to sleep. The next day, I got a call from the cop who wanted to go through the details again. They said they also had the footage and wanted to confirm the identity of the man. I met them at the same gas station, and I watched the grainy footage of what happened in the store. I watched the man reach for the gun, causing him to shoot. The girl started to panic, and he had actually pistol whipped her a couple of times. Then he jumped over the counter and out the door. We then watched the footage of me in the parking lot as the guy held the gun to my chest, and then I drove away. After I confirmed it all, he also asked if he could give my contact details to the victim. Apparently the girl was his daughter, and they had both been working there that night, and they wanted to thank me for coming back to help them. So, I agreed. I actually went to see them in the hospital, and the girl was looking better. She still had 2 black eyes and some stitches and scrapes on the side of her face, but she still had a sense of humor with the whole, "you should see the other guy." They did catch the guy, as they were able to see his car and license plate, which belonged to the guy's mother who worked for USPS. But anyway, they both thanked me for what I did, but I would like to think that I would do it again in a heartbeat, if it meant I could help just one person. For the remaining time I worked at the tow company, I would go to the same station for gas, even if it was out of the way. They actually gave me free coffee and day-old donuts anyways. Now, in 2024, I'm grateful for the technology we have. Better cameras and a cell phone on us pretty much at all times. It makes me a lot quicker to help, but thankfully, I haven't had to do something like that since. I wanted to share an experience with you that I had when I worked at a gas station. This was back when I was in my mid-20s. I had made some mistakes as a young adult. I didn't have the best parents. One I actually never met, and my mom clearly wasn't ready to be a parent. Thus, I became a pretty rebellious teenager. I myself fell in love with a guy that was 10 years older than me, and when I became pregnant at 18, I was under the impression that everything was going to be alright, and the man I was with would support us. So I finished high school but made no plans on bettering myself career-wise, expecting to just be caring for a child for a few years at least. But the honeymoon phase was over before it began when my baby's father quit his job and expected me to pick up the slack while he did God knows what. And that's how I ended up working for a gas station for over a decade. Not many were willing to hire someone who was barely 20 with no experience. This place that I worked at was nice. The people there certainly became more family than my biological ones, other than my sister, who also had a different father that also wasn't in the picture. They knew I had a baby at home, and they were always flexible with me. Ruth, the owner, even cleaned up a small area in the back so I could set up my daughter's playpen to bring her with me. I ended up doing this more often as I couldn't trust her father to watch her either. He quickly became an alcoholic, and I learned that he wasn't a very nice one either. Now, seeing what my mom went through with her various boyfriends, I knew the red flags, and I understood my choices would affect more than just myself, so I knew I had to get out. I dealt with him for 4 years, and I finally decided to take action. When I was 21, I was able to take on more shifts at the station. I would work overtime, I would cover other people's shifts, whatever I could pick up for extra money. Working the night or overtime meant a nice bonus, and I even asked Ruth to cut my checks into two, keeping any time over the 80 hours separate. I cashed those and saved the money so that my ex would only see the flat 80. Yes, he always took my checks. That's how possessive he was. This was also many years ago, so I got a paper check and we cashed it out. And I didn't have a bank account. I was only 18 when I started working and had no idea how to even go about getting an account. Now, after explaining my pity story, sorry, this is how I ended up in the situation that I'm telling you about today. I had started working the overnight shifts. It was rough at first, but being on my feet and keeping busy definitely helped. I also had my daughter with me since she was asleep most of the time there anyways, and no one was really around to disturb her. My ex was typically home at night drinking, so it was a win-win for me anyways. I told him they needed me to work overnights, but that I didn't get any extra pay for it, making it seem like I was disappointed about it. He was none the wiser. Anyway, there I was, working late into the night while my daughter slept peacefully in the back. I kept the door cracked open so I could hear her cry if she woke up. It was probably around 3 or 4 in the morning. I had just gotten my second wind, which was typically about when that happened for me. I started organizing the impulse items near the register and counter, which then spiraled into me deep cleaning because it clearly hadn't been done in quite some time. I was crouching behind the counter when I heard the bell ring, indicating someone had entered. I yelled out, "Hey, welcome in," or something to that effect. The only response I got was a slight grunt, and then the person began whistling. It was a bit odd, but it was also 4 in the morning. The people I saw at that time were typically under the influence, homeless people just needing some respite from the summer heat, or others just getting off work. Based on his response, I assumed it may have been the former. Either way, I know that I have to keep an eye on people, so I stood up to look at the customer. What I saw I never could have expected. It was an older man, tall and gaunt looking. He wore a long overcoat that he was practically swimming in. He had on a baseball cap that was streaked with yellow and brown stains. But the biggest problem that I had with him was the enormous sledgehammer he had resting on his shoulder. My heart immediately dropped. I had never been in a situation like this at work. We had never been robbed, at least not in the time that I worked there, and the most violence we had ever seen was a guy kicking over the trash can because he didn't win his scratch-off tickets. So, was this guy really about to try something with a sledgehammer? I watched him walk down an aisle, look over several items, and pick up one of the canned food items and then put it back down. Then he walked down another aisle and stopped whistling long enough to smile at the item he grabbed. Then, he started back up again, walking toward the front. I quickly looked away, trying to act casual, not wanting to give him any reason to try something, hopefully. Once he reached the counter, he tossed down a single pack of D batteries and stopped whistling. He looked at me with a smirk, and I asked him if that was all he needed. "Y'all don't sell VHS tapes, do you?" Now, this was some time ago, but I hadn't seen VHS camcorders in quite some time. And our random little gas station certainly wasn't selling them and never had. I politely told him, "No, sorry, we don't," and rang up his batteries. He groaned as he tossed down a very crumpled and slightly damp bill, and I gave him his change. He shoved his change in his pocket with the batteries and then turned to walk away before pausing. He looked back at me, smiling, and those few seconds felt like an eternity. I studied his face, worried that I may have to recall it later. His face had deep lines across his forehead, and by his eyes with his skin looking tightly stretched over his cheekbones and jawline. It kind of reminded me of that alien from Men in Black, where he pulled his face tight so that it wasn't too loose, but it was like he forgot to pull his forehead tight. He seriously looked unnatural. Then he spoke to me in a low and curious tone. "You look just like her, you know? You look just like my Emma." I didn't know what to say, so I stared back with my head lopsided like a confused dog. She was beautiful, my Emma. Just like you, and smart. But she just didn't understand. It couldn't see the truth. He curled his fingers toward me, wanting me to come closer. "Do you see the truth, I wonder?" I sat back up, wanting to escape his breath and intimidating stare. I was still frozen with fear, and his choice of conversation did not help the situation. Then he went to adjust how the hammer was resting on his shoulder, but it made me flinch. He looked back at me with his smile wider now. "Do you know what this is for?" I shook my head, still unable to speak. "It's for breaking down walls. Like the walls we build in our heads. The walls that keep us from seeing." He then looked directly into my eyes, and I felt like I was being interrogated. Hell, I would have confessed whatever he wanted me to at this time just to get him to stop staring at me. Emma couldn't see past her walls, but I helped her. I helped her see. He then laid his hand flat palm down on the counter. He mentioned how sometimes we need to break things in order to reveal the truth. Only then can we repair. He began walking towards the door, and then he opened it, and I exhaled, thinking the weird interaction was over. But he turned toward me once more. "You have such beautiful walls. I wonder what truths they hide." Then he walked out whistling. I watched as he walked to the right, down the sidewalk until he was out of my sight. He hadn't even driven there. He had walked. My heart felt like it was going to beat out of my chest. I could hardly breathe. I went to lock the door and then ran to the back with my daughter. Thankfully, she was still sound asleep. I called the police to report whatever had happened, and they said that they would send someone over. Once they arrived, I realized just how stupid I sounded. I explained that a guy came in with a sledgehammer and what all he had said to me, still not able to forget it. They looked at me like I was crazy until I showed them the camera footage. There was no sound, but you could still make out some of the mouth movements and could see the fear written all over my face. They said they would keep an eye out for him, but since he didn't necessarily threaten me or do anything, there was little they could do other than question him for being a suspicious person. I honestly didn't care. I just felt better about telling someone about him rather than keeping it to myself. Thankfully, nothing else happened that night, and I never did see him after that. But, man, there was a time that I had a slight panic attack anytime someone came in when I was working alone and at night. I continued working there for many years after. In fact, I even became a manager. I was able to get away from my ex and get a good place for myself and my daughter on that income, which was a blessing. And even though I was a wreck after that night for some time, I would do it all over again. Just, I would prefer to not ever meet that guy again. My girlfriend and I did a cross-country road trip around 10 years ago, and eventually made it to Florida where my dad was living at the time. While my dad was at work, we would hop in the car and go sightseeing every chance we got. My dad lived in the Tampa area, and there was plenty to see and do within a couple of hours of the house. Beautiful beaches, crystal clear rivers with manatees swimming about, palm trees, tropical plants, and lots of things that were new to us as we come from the opposite corner of the country. all the way up in the Pacific Northwest. One day we decided to drive from the coast, where my dad lived, to the east. It was a part of Florida that we hadn't seen yet, and we were eager to see some of inland Florida. We weren't disappointed, as we found ourselves driving through some really nice green rolling hills with cattle ranches, giant old oak trees with moss hanging from the branches, and country roads that went on forever. I'd been driving for a while and wanted to take a break so I could be the passenger, and just stare out the window, taking it all in. So my girlfriend took over the driving for the time being. Eventually we would decide to stop for a bathroom break, and I would drive the rest of the trip back to my dad's place. We were keeping our eyes open for a good place to stop when we saw a sign that indicated there was a park up ahead. We pulled into the parking lot, parked the car, and headed towards the bathrooms. This was a big park with lots of grass. It really was a beautiful spot. We noticed that there was also a bike path that ran through the park, and people would park their cars here and set out on this path for a bike ride. Now this was midweek, and there were only 2 or 3 cars in the parking lot, and we didn't see any other people around. I headed into the men's room and popped back out, noticing that my girlfriend was still in the women's room, so I decided to have a look around while I waited for her. Across the field of grass, I saw what looked like a trailhead and some signage, so I figured I would investigate. I made my way over to the signboard and was reading some information about the park and the nature trail when I noticed a truck pull into the parking lot. My girlfriend was still in the bathroom, so I decided I would just wait here for her and try to get her attention when she was done, thinking that maybe we'd go for a short hike on the trail. While I was waiting there, I noticed that a tall, slender man wearing a cowboy hat and jeans had gotten out of his truck and was standing there on the sidewalk. Just about the same time, I see my girlfriend come out of the bathroom. She saw me immediately and started walking in my direction. I also saw that the man in the cowboy hat was just standing there motionless, like a statue, staring as my girlfriend walked across the field. As this was happening, I started to get an uneasy feeling in my gut, like something wasn't right with the guy standing there and staring at us. My girlfriend made her way across the field to the edge of the forest, where the trail began, and where I was standing. When she arrived, I asked her if she had noticed the man. She turned around to look as the man just stood there, not moving a muscle, and staring at both of us now. We must have stood there for a couple of minutes, both of us feeling uneasy. It was like we knew that we should not walk any further into the woods. You know that apprehension that you feel when someone is just staring at you with no expression on their face? Like a hunter watching his prey intently. That's what it felt like. The main problem was that we were going to have to cross that field passing right by that man to get back to our car. It was either go hide in the woods until he left, or make our way back to the car. We decided that we would walk back towards the car. Actually, I came up with a plan and told my girlfriend about it. We would walk straight towards him, and because I had a 35mm camera in my hands, my plan was to use that as a weapon if anything happened. I gave my girlfriend the car keys and said that if he made any move towards us, that I was going to rush straight for him and hit him as hard as I could with the camera in my hand, and she was to run straight for our car, get in, and get the hell out of there. When she got back to the highway, she could wait for me there. So we started across the field, and not once did the man move or take his eyes off of us. He just stood there, glaring at us from under the brim of his cowboy hat. Both of us had a really bad feeling as we got closer and closer to the parking lot, but I just stared right back at him, and just tried to give off the vibe that I was ready for a fight if need be. When we were within 10 feet of him, I muttered hello, or how's it going, or something along those lines. I was so nervous that I could barely get the words out of my mouth. He said nothing and just continued to stare. Finally, we passed by him and hurriedly made our way to the car, jumped in, and locked the doors. This was the first time I saw him move at all. He slowly turned around and continued to size us up. Once we were in the car with the doors locked, we felt a sense of relief. I backed up, and as we turned to leave, I told my girlfriend to try and memorize his license plate number. We thought maybe this guy was some kind of predator who was at the parking lot looking for prey. It was the perfect place for someone with bad intentions like that. A remote park with a bike path, midweek when there weren't a lot of people around. Honestly, the whole experience felt like he was sizing us up. Did we look weak? Was anyone else around who would witness it if he tried to do something? I still get the chills today when I think about him standing there and staring at us. We talked about it the whole drive back to my dad's place. Should we call the police and let them know that there was a weirdo hanging out at the park? Both of us were still kind of freaked out. We told my dad all about it when we returned, but he kind of just laughed it off and said that we were probably just being paranoid. We eventually decided not to report it to the police because what would we even tell them? Nothing happened, thankfully, but even 10 years later, the thought of that guy freaks me out. And if I mention it to my now ex-girlfriend, she agrees that it feels like we got lucky that day. So, I don't know exactly how to start this, but it has been an event that has stuck with me since I was a child. I'm 20 years old now. I don't remember exactly how old I was at the time, around 10, 12 years old at the oldest. Anyways, I was having a sleepover with two of my friends at the time. Let's call them S and T. We were staying the night at S's house, since they had a house unlike T and I who lived in the same apartment complex. For some reason, our barely preteen brains thought it would be a great idea to go down to our elementary school at around 11 p.m. I really don't know why S's mom let us kids go down there without an adult, but it wasn't even a mile away, and I was a kid and thought that she was cool for letting us go. It was a typical Washington night. Barely any stars to see from the light pollution, mushy grass from the rain never being soaked up all the way, and the dark-hilled forest reminding at least me that anyone could be in the woods watching us. We made our way up to the school from the back parking lot, and through the field next to the forest since it was a straight shot from the house. In all honesty, when we first arrived and were messing around on the play set, I didn't sense anything wrong. When we started playing on the slide, I got a cold feeling in my gut. I looked around us, and I couldn't see anyone in the school windows, in the field, or approaching us. A couple of minutes go by, and T and I get bored with the slide, but S stays. So T and I go to try and practice our tricks on the bars. Not like the monkey bars, we always called them gymnastic bars, but they were a long line of bars that peaked at about 8 to 10 feet at the tallest. T wasn't as tall or as practiced as me, so she wanted to use the lowest bar to the far right, at the edge of the playground. I helped her for a couple of minutes with her flips before I started spacing out and staring at the edge of the playground. I call it an edge since it was about 1.5 foot wooden border that kept all the cedar chips from spilling onto the basketball court. As I was staring, my entire body went cold before I could fully resolve what my eyes were seeing. I couldn't really see it, but my brain was trying to see it as a person that was hunched, sitting on the border, faced away from us. It was almost like a darker-than-black mask that resembled a person with a hoodie on. There was a head shape, but not really a neck. As I stared, I kept getting more frightened because I was sure this was not a person. I couldn't see any texture to the clothes. I just couldn't truly see them. I don't even know how to explain it right, but it was like a void. It wasn't that dark out. Yes, it was nighttime, but it wasn't like the total darkness of a closed closet. But this thing was just the absence of everything. Like it was swallowing the light that would illuminate it. I finally snapped out of it and tried to get T's attention. I lightly smacked her arm a couple of times. T, stop, please. She was confused as she was facing me and couldn't see what had me paler than I already was. I didn't know what to say, and rapidly pointed over her shoulder. When she looked, I saw her stiffen. I was almost relieved that she was wearing the look that I was. I guess I gathered a couple of brain cells at this point, and told T to turn on the flashlight on their phone. Thankfully, she listened. But when she shined it on this thing, it didn't make a damn difference. It still looked like the same empty mass. I was already starting to panic when I realized it really wasn't a trick of the light, but then, to my terror, this thing turned to look at me. It freaking looked at me. With no eyes, no face, just an impression. I could feel it looking at me. I didn't know what it was going to do, but I really didn't want to find out, so I yanked T so hard away from this thing. If I was thinking, I would have apologized, but I just wanted to get away from this thing and for us to be back home. T eventually got the message, so we started sprinting towards the slide and I started yelling at S. We need to go. Get down. I'm not joking. Get off the freaking slide. We need to get home now. As I'm yelling at S, they didn't seem to hear the panic in my voice and pulled the little kid, but I don't want to go. I've had it at this point, and I start to reconsider my friend in the back of my mind, but being the responsible one, but not the adult of the group, I grab S's ankle and start pulling them down the slide. It didn't take much, since it was a losing battle for them. I don't know if they really understood what was happening at this point, since T started explaining that there was a man over there, probably a, quote, tweaker. I knew in my heart that it was not a person. I've dealt with the paranormal before, and I wasn't about to let this thing follow us. Eventually, I got a hold of T and S and started booking it out of there. It wasn't the easiest, with S having a death wish and wanted to go back to see it, and T having a medical condition in their legs that made it a lot harder to run fast with the limited mobility, with a sprinkle of asthma and no inhaler to top it off. I was gonna drag them back by their collars if I had to. I was determined to let that thing just go back where it came from and leave us be. We made it back safe. Maybe a little uneasy for the night, but we told S's mom. It really didn't spook her per se, since she was a self-proclaimed witch and ex-goth that liked all things weird and supernatural. She believed it, but was miffed that her own kid wasn't being safe, especially with her kid living in a haunted house herself. I know that sounds crazy, but at least 3 of their relatives died in the house, and we had plenty of paranormal encounters in that house to at least respect the idea that we were not alone. In the end, we didn't experience that thing again, thank God. I've seen some things, but I really didn't want to deal with something that struck so much cardinal fear in me so quickly. Everything about it just seemed wrong, like it didn't fit where it was. As I've gotten older, I've stopped trying to rationalize it, more of just understood that not everything in this world is understood. And you just kind of got to roll with the punches. Before I met and moved in with my now girlfriend, I had quite the experience and bad luck with some previous homes. The story in particular is from an apartment I lived in. Each building on the property had 3 floors with 4 apartments on each floor, as well as a laundry room on each floor. We had shared washers and dryers. My apartment was on the 2nd floor and was at the end of the hallway. The complex itself wasn't bad. Unfortunately, it seemed my place was below the couple that seemed to only scream at each other to communicate, but it never seemed to escalate. Someone else liked to cook a lot, as it usually smelled heavenly coming home, but sometimes they used way too much onion. But the real problem I had with this place, the problem that also caused me to move, was one of the people that lived on the same floor as me, but at the front of the building. I'll refer to him as Todd. When I moved in, I had my brother and a few friends help me with the big items. I'm a very small woman, so there was no way that I could carry in my couch, bed, and dresser by myself. There were a few times while we were moving back and forth that Todd had stepped out of his door and would nod at us, or step out of the way when they carried something heavy. But otherwise, he didn't talk to any of us, at least not at those times. But on one of the last days of moving, it was just me, getting those last odds and ends that I could easily toss into my car. As I carried an open box of cleaner under my arm, and a trash bag of random items with the other hand, Todd came out of his room and immediately went to grab the box from me, offering to help. I'm pretty bad with meeting new people, or small talk, so I just smiled and said thanks. As we walked down the hall, I was silent and he introduced himself. After I unlocked my door, I set the bag down again and took the box from him. With the box in my hands again, I told him my name and thanked him. And he again tried to talk to me. "Just moving in, huh?" he said, obviously trying to come up with something. He seemed about as bad as myself at starting conversations. I kind of chuckled and said yes, and he pointed out to his apartment and said if I needed help with moving anything else, or putting something together, to just let him know. I thanked him, and I shut the door as he walked away. And the rest of that first week was uneventful, really. I unpacked and settled in, and really just kept to myself as I organized my new place. The only other common factor in those days was seeing Todd when I left or came home. He would just be leaving or coming home too, sometimes taking out his garbage. He would always greet me and try to make small talk, but that was about it. But as time went on, seeing him like that became more and more frequent, and patterned, even. And to be honest, it was kind of disruptive. Between my job and trying to complete my degree, I didn't have a lot of free time. Sometimes I had half an hour to get home from work, change, and then get to class. But even on those days that I appeared to be in a rush, Todd wanted to have these long conversations. I know I just sound like a jerk, but I really don't care. When someone is obviously rushing to their door and you see them leave just as fast, and it's always on the same day every week, maybe you can put things together that they're busy, maybe? But not Todd. Todd would follow me to my door telling me about something that happened to him that day, and I would wait for him to finish the story before I went into my apartment. What else was I supposed to do? Shut the door in his face? There was one time where he wanted to show me something in his apartment, and I told him that I didn't have time on Wednesdays. And he understood, so I guess being straightforward with him worked there. Todd stopped trying to have such long conversations on Wednesdays, and instead resorted to always opening the door to the complex when I came home from work. He would always be by the door, for whatever reason, and would hold it open for me. Then he would wish me a good evening. To be there every week was a bit odd, in my opinion. Think about it. Your neighbor you barely knew would meet you every week at the entrance of the building? But at the time, I just maybe thought that was Todd and who he was. Maybe he was like the neighborhood watch, or I guess complex watch. Who knows? But then I began to notice how every time I had free time, Todd was around. When I went out for my walks, he would be leaving too. When I went to the grocery store, he would be at his door asking if I wanted this or that. and claiming he bought too many bananas or loaves of bread and didn't want it to go to waste. I couldn't even sit at the Starbucks I liked to go to every Friday in peace because he would always end up there and would always act surprised to see me and try to talk to me. And like I said, I know that I sound like an a-hole here and admit that. I was okay with just having a conversation here and there. I could even understand that maybe he was just lonely and wanted some company. We were probably the closest in age compared to everyone else I had seen in our complex, so I did feel bad, but Todd was starting to become a normal part of my daily life. And to me, that felt weird. I still barely knew him, and he sat by me as we drank coffee like we were longtime friends. But once I started talking about it out loud to a good friend of mine, she brought up a good point. How was he able to do all this? How did he know almost the exact time I got home or would be leaving? I certainly didn't share my schedule with him. I did tell him that I was in school and working, not expecting it to be a big deal. I'm an executive assistant and secretary, so even if he tried to call and get my schedule, he would have either talked to me or a woman that I work alongside with, and she would have told me if someone called asking about me. My friend told me that I should keep tabs on him too, to make sure he wasn't stalking me, but at the time I thought that was pretty dramatic. Following me for company, I could see. Stalking me? There's no reason to stalk me. I wasn't a remarkable girl, but the thought stayed in the back of my mind nonetheless. But one Saturday night, my opinion shifted hard. I went out with some friends for dinner and a movie. Afterwards, we went for some drinks before I finally went home. My friend offered to let me stay at her place and save myself the Uber, but I had homework to finish before Monday, so I declined, and I told her that I would call her the next day. I wish I would have just stayed. It was probably around 1 a.m. when I finally walked into the complex. As I passed Todd's apartment, I heard his door open. Tired and slightly intoxicated, I continued into my apartment, ignoring his calls for me. Once in my apartment, I locked up and kicked off my shoes when Todd started knocking on the door. I reluctantly answered, hoping he wouldn't stay long. He smiled and said, "Hey, late night, huh?" I nodded, hoping I was portraying that I was not in the mood to talk. "I was just worried when I didn't hear you come home at your usual time." My usual time? How does he know my usual time? I asked him about it, and he mentioned how I usually got home from class on Saturdays in the afternoon, and typically didn't leave unless I went for a walk. What the hell? Had he been following me? My head was now spinning and my heart racing, but I still asked him, "How do you know what time I get home, Todd? Are you stalking me?" He looked offended by my comment and immediately became defensive. He said he's not stalking me, but just looking out for me, since I was so young and small and lived alone. I told him I didn't need him to look out for me because I did just fine for myself. He threw his hands up and said, "Well, I thought you would appreciate the gesture." I again explained to him how he seems to be always around and it makes me uncomfortable. I told him that he's keeping more tabs on me than my own father. He again didn't seem to like that response. I could see his temples flare as he clenched his jaw. Knowing nothing good was to come from this, I told him that it would be best to leave me alone, and went to try and close the door when he stopped it. He smacked it with his hands and then started shouting about how I should be thanking him for what he does. He went on and on about how stalking is when someone follows somebody around, but all he did was watch where I went. After berating me with this nonsensical speech, he pointed his finger at me and said, "In fact, I think you owe me for all that I do for you," and tried to walk into my apartment. I screamed at him to leave me alone and get out, but he continued trying to fight me at the door. Then, the alcohol, stress, and fear swirled in my head and stomach, and I threw up. Right on Todd. I guess it was a solution because he jumped backwards, called me nasty, and walked off. I immediately locked my door and ran to my phone to call the cops. While on the phone, I heard someone knocking at my door. I looked through the viewer and saw that it was the middle-aged woman that lived in the apartment across from me. I cracked the door open and she said that she heard him shouting and had called the cops, which made sense, because they were already walking in when she knocked too. I explained what happened to the cops and they went to his apartment, but he didn't answer. They knocked, they banged on the door, but he never answered it. Ultimately, I did press charges, and the next day I spoke to the office management to ask about changing buildings. I was upset. I had just moved into this place. I couldn't afford to go through more app fees and deposits, so that was my only option. Thankfully, they took it very seriously, and they were able to move me pretty quickly. I stayed at my friend's house until I got to the new apartment, and always had someone with me when I was moving. Surprisingly, I didn't see Todd once in the process. Not that I'm complaining, though. I'm just thankful that nothing worse happened that night. No matter how embarrassing it might have been, I think it certainly helped. Oh, and I'm very grateful for that good neighbor that did call the cops and checked on me. I'm not even upset that she didn't come over sooner. She was older than me, but she was also just as small and had 2 kids there, so I get it. And as for Todd, I just hope that we never meet again. When I was 18, I started working at a gas station right outside the city that I lived in. It was probably a 15-minute drive tops, which worked out in case I had to get a ride to and from work. I had a pretty crappy hand-me-down car that didn't like to run when it was too hot or too cold, or any day that ended with a Y. You get the idea. And since I was still living at home, my parents or older brother would sometimes take me to work. So it was nice working close. I chose to work there because, 1, they were one of the few people that actually called me in for an interview, and really I just needed something to do after I graduated, while I figured out what I was doing with my life. The pay wasn't great, but I worked with some pretty cool people and the job itself was pretty simple. At least, most of the time. The lunch rush was a bit annoying, or Sunday afternoons after church let out. Our gas station seemed to be the place to go to continue sermon. But regardless, I could handle it, and it certainly made the day fly by. But sometimes we got some odd people, or the occasional drunk that would try to cause problems, and being a smaller girl, I stayed back to let the others handle those. But this story is actually about one of those times that I seemed to be in the center of it all. It was a late night, and we had just finished cleaning up the hot food stations. We shut them down at 9 p.m., and they have to be thoroughly cleaned. They were pretty close to the register, so I was also in charge of ringing people up. Susan was out by the pump sweeping and cleaning up around the area. She's an older lady that's been there forever, so I feel like they just let her do whatever she wants because cleaning the parking lot isn't even on the checkoff list, or something we were ever told to do. Then Anthony was in the back juggling the tasks of back office work and some inventory prep. Anthony was actually a good friend of my brother's, who I had a bit of a crush on at the time, so I was happy to work with him. He was always really nice to me and looked out for me, so really the job wasn't bad at all. So anyways, that was our setup for the night. I was pretty much it for the front of the store, but it wasn't unusual for me either. While I was wiping down the shields, I saw a van pull up out front. They had parked across 3 parking spots, and seemed to hit their brakes pretty hard, based on how the car lurched forward. The van looked like one of those old Chevy travel vans. My dad used to have one identical to it, but it was red instead of green. Wanting to see the idiot that parked like that, I continued to watch as a man got out of the driver's seat, walked around and up to the door, and entered the gas station. The man looked to be in his mid-40s, average height with buzz-cut hair. In all honesty, he looked pretty normal. That is, until he started talking. I greeted him as I normally do, and when he spotted me, he quickly advanced towards me. "Oh, thank God. I'm having some car troubles. Would you mind taking a look at it?" I immediately chuckled at this comment. I was this little 18-year-old girl. What made this grown man think that I, of all people, knew anything about cars? "I'm sorry, sir, I would have no clue. I don't know anything about cars beyond putting gas in them." "Oh, come on. You look like a smart girl. I'm sure you could figure it out." Why was this guy so adamant that I looked in his van, and that I could fix it? It was weird. I again pushed back to say that I couldn't help, and even offered to go get Anthony as he might be able to help, but the guy was insistent that I should help him. He began begging me. He offered to pay me in cash or beer. I told him I wasn't even old enough to drink, reminding him again that I was only 18. And then he hit me with, "Well, I've got a litter of puppies in the back. You can have one if you want." That's when I realized just how messed up this whole thing was sounding. So I told him in a very firm voice, "Sir, I'm not a child. I'm not going to go out to your van for anything, and I can't help you with it." He immediately tried to go back to pouting and begging, when thankfully Anthony walked back into the lobby. "Is everything okay here? Can I help you with something, sir?" He tried shaking his head, but I immediately stepped back towards Anthony and told him that he was having car troubles and asked me to take a look. Anthony looked at both of us funny and then kind of laughed. He told the man that he could see if he could help, but the man shouted, "No, I want the girl." That was the comment that really scared me. This now seemed like more than just car troubles. Anthony then took a step forward to be in front of me and told him firmly, "Look, man, you and I both know she's not going out there. So either I can help you, or you can leave." The man stared at us for what felt like several minutes. He looked angry. I thought he might try to do something to Anthony, but instead, he called me a name and then stormed out of the store. We watched from the door as he walked around to get back in the driver's side, and to my surprise, I watched another guy sit up in the passenger seat. I didn't even know someone else was in there. And just as quickly as he pulled up, he also burned out of the parking lot, making Susan come back inside and ask what that was all about. I explained to both of them what all had happened, and even Susan laughed and said, "Puppies? What is this, the 1950s? We all laughed and tried to shrug it off, but honestly, it still kinda spooked me. He drove it into the parking lot just fine and left in the van just fine. And he was adamant that I had to help him. Why me? The fact that he tried so hard and even tried bribing me made me feel really uncomfortable. I was ready to just let it go, and thankful that he was gone, but Anthony was insistent on calling the police to report it. To my surprise, they came by and took it very seriously. They even said they had reports of a suspicious van that had been driving around some nearby neighborhoods that was reported by parents. They saw the van slow down and even stop in front of their place, but would drive away when they went outside or tried to call out to them. They never came back and told us they caught him or anything, so I'm not sure if they did or not, but that certainly did not make me feel any better. If it was the same guy, then was he trying to abduct me? For weeks afterwards, I became kind of paranoid anytime there was a guy that came in alone, as bad as that sounds. I made sure that I had a ride to and from work beforehand, so that way I wasn't waiting around alone. Not that Anthony allowed me to, though. He made me wait in the back, which was nice. I only worked there for about a year after that. The store got robbed the next year, and that traumatized me pretty badly. And thankfully, no one was hurt, but you really start to reevaluate your life when you're staring down a barrel. But that was my experience working at a gas station, and all I can say is thanks for the experience, but so long. I will not miss it. Hey Raven, love the podcast. Been listening to it a lot at work lately as I work in a scene shop. After listening to a couple of the paranormal episodes, I believe I have a story that could fit right in, and look forward to sharing it for some of my own peace of mind. I think you'll agree that it won't disappoint. I have a total of 3 different stories, all based around the same area. To begin, some backstory. I grew up as a theater kid. Well, to be honest, since I grew up in a theater family, I didn't really have an option to not love theater. Back in my 20s, I'm in my 30s now, I lived in Indiana for a couple of years. After multiple 60-plus hour work weeks, I decided I needed to develop a life outside of work. I couldn't find a theater nearby that I thought I was good enough to audition for, but I thought it might be cool to look into some haunted houses. When you really think about it, there really isn't much of a leap between haunted houses and a theater. Both have rather involved scenery, require actors, and a fair amount of technicians. So, I found one nearby, and I worked there for a couple of years. Unfortunately, I was laid off from my job in a mass layoff, so I moved out of Indiana and back home with my mother in Ohio. I knew right away that I had to find a haunted house to work at. Luckily, Ohio is not shy of multiple haunted houses. I eventually applied to work at the Mansfield Reformatory. For those of you who don't know this facility, it's famously known for being the filming site of Shawshank Redemption and a couple of scenes from Air Force One. Later, I would find out that it would be one of the most haunted places in all of Ohio. I was hired to be both a technician for the setup of the haunted house and to be a relief actor when the haunt was actually up and running. I would basically go to different rooms and let the actors take bathroom and snack breaks since, some nights, we were open 6+ hours. The first story begins when I was setting up for the haunt. Because the Mansfield Reformatory is a year-round museum, we would only have 4 weeks to set up the haunt starting at the end of August, before we would open October 1st. One afternoon, I was carrying a rather large animatronic up the staircase, there with one of my coworkers, who we'll call Bill. Bill was a rather large man. I'm 6'1" and weigh 300 pounds, and yet I had to look up to Bill to give some scale. As we were carrying the animatronic, his hand suddenly dropped this fairly large metal frame to the floor, sending a rather intense vibration through my arms. I look up and see him holding a hand over his forehead in pain, groaning. I immediately asked what happened and if he was okay. He said it felt like something had cut his forehead. As he pulled his hand away, I noticed some blood on his forehead, so I told him to lean down so I could see. When he leaned down to me, I could see that something or someone had sliced a very small upside-down crucifix into his skin. Typically, as we set up for the haunt, the spirits there like to mess with us. Unplug cords, move spray paint cans, and the like. Once the haunt season officially starts and thousands of people are coming through that prison every night, it's almost like the spirits up their game. My next circumstance came once we had opened, and I was the relief actor to the haunt. I found a lot of enjoyment being able to move at my leisure and scare people in different rooms. There were lots of eerie locations in that prison, however, none compared to solitary confinement. Once to step into that wing of the prison, it feels like someone has pulled all the air out of your lungs. And you get this awful feeling in your head like you'll never experience joy again. One night, we were low on relief actors, so I had to extend my round into solitary confinement. Whenever I have to go into that area, I try to have a buddy with me. To be honest, it was plain out unsettling. In addition to the peeling paint on the walls, we only made it worse by pumping scary Halloween music through the whole prison. You know the kind. Low, ominous noises, with people screaming and eerie metal grinding noises that send shivers up your spine. That night, I had just given the actor at the top of the stairs his break, which meant I had to go down 3 flights of stairs, in the dark, by myself, to find the next actor. As I headed down the steps, I remembered telling the actor, "Wish me luck," to which he jokingly said, "You're gonna need it." I made it down the first flight of stairs with an uneasy feeling, but nothing too unnerving. As I descended the second flight, I started getting a feeling that someone was watching me. This would be impossible, though. There wasn't a group of people behind me, I was sure of it. Nothing is less scary than seeing a guy dressed as a bloody butcher carefully and methodically descending stairs. As I rounded the bottom step onto the landing, I assumed I would be safe from anything too startling, because this floor has been chained off with chain link fence from floor to ceiling around the landing due to structural reasons. It is literally impossible to get to the other side of this fence without a key to the padlock. How then is it possible that as I looked down that hallway to my left, where there should have been a black void, there was a woman glowing in a bluish-white light? The white was so intense it looked similar to a welding arch, but somehow with just enough detail that I could make out that it was a woman. Near the end of the season, I experienced an event that I can only describe as an expression of evil in spiritual form. Since I was living with my mother at this time, in my early 20s, she had concerns that I may bring something home that attached itself to me. To counter this, I would call her once I got home, usually around 2 in the morning, and she would meet me outside to bless me with holy water before I came inside. At the time, I thought this was pretty unnecessary, but she was giving me a place to live, so I figured compromises were necessary. It was one of the last nights of the haunt, which meant that we saw an even higher number of people than normal, somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000, so I didn't get home until pretty late, around 3 a.m. I tried calling my mother, but she was out for the night, understandably so. So I walked in, showered, and went straight to bed. The next morning I was watching TV, and my normally cheery mother walked into the living room with an extremely stern look on her face and stared at me. A stare that pierced through me, almost as if she was given a life-changing illness. She stared at me a long while and quietly said, "You brought something home," and she left the room. I thought that was quite odd, but quickly forgot about it. That night, my mother started talking in her sleep, but it was incoherent sleep jarble, so I didn't think much of it. However, the sleep talking would quickly advance into something more sinister. Night 1 was just mumbled sleep talking. Night 2 was mumbled talking with the occasional swear word. Night 3 was the occasional swear word with my name thrown in. And Night 4 was my name with death threats. And that's correct. My sweet mother, who at one point was training to become a nun before deciding she wanted children, was saying, "You're gonna die." And not just saying it, but yelling it from her bedroom. In the morning, I told her what happened, and she could not believe what I was telling her. Night 5 started off innocently enough. My mother and I were watching a movie, but she had grown tired and she said she was off to bed. So we said goodnight. After an hour or so, I heard snoring coming from her room. Not a moment later, 2 books fell off the bookcase to my right. I tried my best to come up with a logical reason why or how they could have done this, and then a 3rd book flew off the shelf and hurled itself 10 feet across the room. I had no explanation for this. I went to my mom's room and knocked on the door, and from inside, I could hear her sleep talking again, but this time it wasn't swearing. This time, she was speaking backwards, with my name mixed into it. I thought to myself, absolutely not, I'm just going to bed. I closed the door to my room and locked it. I was thoroughly freaked out without a clue of what to do. I had never experienced anything like this. I sat on my bed and, as I did, papers from the printer in the corner aggressively shot out of the tray and whirled around my room like a cyclone. As this happened, I remember a lightning bolt of fear shooting up through my leg and up my entire spine, paralyzing me. I don't remember anything after that, because I fainted. I woke up early in the morning and marched into my mother's room demanding her to call a priest or I'm out. I was very worked up at this moment. Here's where it gets curious. My mom called 3 different priests and psychics asking for help. They were always willing to help, but on the day of, whenever she would go to their house or office, they would see her and immediately turn her away, saying that there's nothing they could do for her. I told her that it sounded like you might be getting scammed, and she said, I would agree, but they aren't taking my money. They don't even know where I live, so what are they scamming? And she heard from a friend that a well-known psychic was coming to the area, and they might be able to help. The psychic was coming to one of their houses, and they were having a group reading. When she showed up at the door, the psychic answered, looked at her and said, I can't help you, and then closed the door on her. She was understandably shocked and thought that the psychic was pretty rude and went home. Later that day, she received a call from the psychic saying he could come over the next day to help her, but he was acting really dodgy on the phone. I told my mother to be careful and that it sounded like he wanted to swindle her, and she agreed, but anything was worth trying at this point. When he came over, I was sadly at a part-time job, so I couldn't be there, but she told me that he came over and performed an exorcism. As soon as it was done, he got violently sick and ran outside and started vomiting. He looked back at her from outside and said that she would be getting extremely sick for the next couple of years, then ran to his car and squealed out of the driveway in a hurry. After she told me this, I asked her how much she paid him. She looked at me and said, That's the thing, I didn't, he just left. For the next couple of years, my mom did get violently sick. She developed many autoimmune diseases and has honestly never been quite the same as before I worked at this haunt. So, a word to the wise, if you go poking around in things you don't understand, be careful about the repercussions. They might just stick with you for a while. Hello, I'm a new listener, but I've been constantly listening for the past week or so. As a stay-at-home mom of a 2-year-old, it helps calm my nerves listening to strange stories, I guess. These stories have brought back lots of memories from when I was a child, as well as more recent strange events. I have many to share, but I'll go in order as best I can. One of my earliest memories is when I was probably about 3 or 4 years old. I had health issues, and I would sleep in bed with my grandma because my parents worked the 3rd shift. Every night, she and I would read books or color for about 15 minutes, and then go to bed while watching TV. I remember seeing the man in the doorway, and oftentimes he would play with me too. I was never scared of him. I would be reading books or something while my grandma was doing something else, and he would come to me and talk and play. I remember him tickling me so much one day while I was in bed. My grandma was sitting on the edge of the bed and I was lying in bed, but he was tickling me, and I was laughing so hard. Like the kind of laugh where you can barely catch your breath. She looked at me and kind of laughed it off at first, probably thinking I was just being a silly kid, not wanting to go to bed. However, this became a regular occurrence. At first, I think that my grown-ups all thought I had an overactive imagination and a close friendship with my imaginary friend, until I started telling them what he looked like. Looking back on it, I don't really remember ever seeing his face, but at the time I definitely did. I was able to describe him all the way from his cowboy hat to his boots. As an adult, I don't really remember what he looked like, but apparently the way that I described him at the time was exactly what he looked like. I remember when my mom heard me describe what he was wearing, her eyes filled with tears, and my grandma's hands went all shaky, and a sentimental look took over her eyes. I didn't understand until I was a bit older that the man in the doorway was my grandpa, my grandma's husband, who passed away in 1976. This would have happened around the year 2000 or so. My mom was only 3 when he passed away, so she wasn't able to fill my head with a whole lot of information about him. The outfit that I described him wearing was apparently exactly what my grandma had him buried in. I don't remember a whole lot from then except for this, but I really doubt that my grandma would have shared with her 3 to 4-year-old granddaughter what her dead husband was buried in. And there are no photos of his burial outfit either. Also, up to that point, I don't think I had ever seen any pictures of him, but again, I don't think anyone would have been like, "Hey kid, this is your dead grandpa." I mean, maybe they did. But for me to conjure up this man coming in and tickling me, and playing games and reading to me, I feel like that's not really a thing. This was a core memory for me. It's something that's always stuck with me, and it's strange that I can remember this happening and not really am able to remember what he looked like. Now I think of it as an invisible man talking to me and tickling me, as strange as that is. Now that my grandma has passed and my son has been born, I wonder if he is seeing her the way I saw her husband. I have another story about her passing and my son being conceived, but that's for another time. Sometimes, while I'm putting my son to bed, he'll start laughing as if someone is making him laugh, like playing peekaboo or something. But I'm lying in bed next to him and not making any sound. And we have no TV in the bed. Just a nightlight that projects a galaxy onto the ceiling. Now I catch myself wondering if he's just a kid with an overactive imagination, or if there is something more to his sleepy, late-night giggles. Hi, Raven. Over the last month, I have come to the realization that there is a mimic living in my home. The first incident was about a month ago. I was in the living room early one morning looking for a lost remote control. For some reason, the remote controls in my house always end up lost and then found in weird places. My 23-year-old daughter occasionally spends the night with me, and this morning she had spent the night prior and was still sleeping, so I thought. As I was looking for the lost remote, I heard my daughter say, "Hey, Mama?" in a sleepy tone as if she was about to ask me something. I replied, "Yes?" and waited a few seconds and didn't get a reply. I said, "Maya? What is it?" Again, no reply. Confused, I walked into the bedroom that she usually sleeps in and she wasn't there. I looked around the house and she was not in the house anywhere, so I called her phone. When she answered, I asked her where she went, and she told me that she had gone to work early. I was confused because I clearly heard my daughter in the house just minutes earlier asking for me. I didn't tell her what happened because I felt that she would just say I'm probably hearing things, but I know beyond a doubt that I heard my daughter in the house. A week later, my fiancé and I are standing in the hallway in front of the full-size mirror, and I'm trimming up his beard, when we both heard my son walk out of his room into the kitchen and say, "Mama?" in a worried type of tone, as if he was about to tell me something concerning. I looked over and said, "What is it, Hunter?" And no one was there. I was so shocked and confused, I stood silently and just stared at my fiancé as he softly said, "You didn't imagine it, because I heard it too." We both walked into my son's room and knocked on his door. He said, "Come in." I asked my son if he had just walked into the hallway and asked for me, and he said that he had not left his room at all. He was playing a video game the entire time. So, who was just in the kitchen hallway asking for me? It remains a mystery. A few days after that, my daughter thought that she heard me in the bathroom. She texted my phone and asked if I was going to be much longer in the bathroom because she wanted to shower before bed. I told her that I wasn't in the bathroom. Her reply was, "I literally just heard you, Mom." She said that she knocked on the door and asked how much longer I was going to be, and supposedly I replied, "Just a second." She said that she heard me mumbling something and then it got quiet, so after waiting outside the bathroom for a few minutes, she texted me. I was never in the bathroom, and when she opened the door, it was empty. She swears that she heard me in the bathroom, though, and I believe her. Up until this point, I had not told my daughter about the experiences we had prior. The scary part is when I told her what had been happening, she said the same thing had been happening to her. She would hear her 3-year-old son, my grandson, playing, laughing and asking for her, and when she would reply, no one would be there. She said she thought that she was losing her mind and decided not to say anything for fear that people would think that she was hearing things and wouldn't believe her. Well, I definitely believe her, because as of this day, I hear echoes of people's voices while I'm talking to them before they can even reply. I hear my dog barking in the distance while he is literally right beside me, not making a sound. My fiancé claims that something has been tickling the bottom of his feet at night while he's sleeping. I heard my 3-year-old grandson running through the hallway toward my room and saw his shadow making his way to my room before it stopped and completely vanished. My grandson wasn't there. He was asleep in his bed. Does anyone know what this could be? I feel that it's a mimic, but it's now touching us at night. I've tried cleansing my home with herbs and different methods of purifying the energy in the house. I've even set out protection wards. So far, it remains unknown whether this thing is planning on staying for a while or moving out of my house. My house came on a Sears Roebuck truck back in 1918 and was placed neatly on this small dead-end street with 4 other houses, an old depot several hundred feet away from railroad tracks. I believe that it is upon sacred lands of slaughtered Potawatomi Native Americans. An elderly childless couple were the previous owner, and the only owners according to county records. I never met the woman, as she had passed away in the house a few years prior to the sale. Long story, but my husband's grandparents, who lived next door, told us that we had to buy it. This was the mid-'80s, due to our growing business on their property. We took down the fence and expanded the business onto both properties. Being young and having just welcomed our firstborn, I decided to make the best of the situation. There wasn't much ghost activity at first. There was mostly eerie feelings like being watched. Occasionally, the master bedroom door would move or open and close sometimes, and I could sometimes hear footsteps. Nothing too scary. In the late 90s, we purchased another house about a mile down the road. This house was very small, and our family had grown to 3 children, and things were a bit crowded. We kept this house as the business was still on it, and this house was used as the office. Fast forward to several years later. My husband's grandparents passed, and we rented his grandparents' house to a worker while still using both properties to continue using for the business. Then came the very messy divorce in 2004. We sold the business in the divorce, so this house was vacant. I moved back in this house in the fall of 2005, and all was good for a while. The same opening and closing of the main bedroom door, the footsteps around the bed, and the feeling of being watched. I never felt threatened, so I brushed it off. Then, a few years in, after remodeling and making some changes, activity picked up. Stuff like the ceiling fan turning on by itself in the living room while I was watching TV. I have some ceramic figurines and a few other memorabilia on a small dresser as an altar to honor my late brother in another bedroom. Upon entering the room the next morning, the room felt weird, very heavy. 2 of the 4 figurines were missing. I looked around and one figurine was 5 feet across the room, and the other one lay on the ground at the bottom of the dresser. Also, a small 5x8 framed picture that hung above these figurines had been removed and placed neatly in the place of the 2 missing figurines. If it had fallen off the wall, it would have knocked over or broke the other figurines. I stared at the picture and wondered why that picture. There were a few other pictures, but it had picked that particular one. It was a picture of an Amish family traveling down a dirt road, with small children throwing feed off the back of the wagon at some geese following behind them. There were other pictures of my brother that remained undisturbed. I figure it may have associated with the scene in that picture. Still a mystery and only a guess. I had heard asking the ghost to leave and burning some sage usually does the trick, but no. More activity ensued. It seemed the more I saged, the more activity followed. Then the straw that broke the camel's back. I had my small kitchen remodeled in 2020 during lockdown. Everything seemed okay until recently. I had bought a spice rack that holds the many spices that I frequently use, as I do a lot of baking. A week after purchasing and filling the rack, my employee stopped by and went into the kitchen to get a cup of coffee. His back was turned away from the rack, approximately 3 feet away, when suddenly spices started flying off the rack in an avalanche motion. He turned to catch a few. I was a few feet away and came to help, thinking he must have bumped into the counter below the shelf that held the rack, causing the rack to shake or disturb, but no. I saged the entire kitchen, and I asked whatever it was to leave. I replaced the spices, and a few days later I was baking. My back was to this rack again, and the spices flew off this rack at me. Also across the room by the sink, a plastic container and a few prep bowls also fell over, and then a small wooden angel in the room next to the kitchen flew off the shelf. Totally fed up, I called a friend who does ghost clearings. Not sure if she did distance clearings, as she lived on the West Coast, and I lived near Chicago. I told her that I must have a portal. She scanned my house from the distance and informed me that I had 4 open portals, which she closed immediately and cleared the entities. I've held my breath, but am happy to say it's been a month, and no activity thus far. However, I still do sleep with one eye open. The neighborhood had always been quiet. A small suburban oasis where everyone knew each other by name, and front lawns were meticulously maintained. I moved in 3 years ago, drawn to the tree-lined streets and promise of peaceful living, but that was before the Simons moved in next door. It started small, as these things often do. The Simons arrived in the middle of the night, their moving truck groaning under the weight of what seemed like an excessive amount of furniture for a house that size. I watched from my window as they unloaded, noticing that they didn't bring any lights. Strange silhouettes against the dim streetlights. I shrugged it off, figuring they were just night owls. The first unsettling incident occurred a few weeks later. I was gardening in the front yard when I noticed Ms. Simon standing at her window staring at me. Her face was blank, eyes unblinking. I waved, trying to be friendly, but she didn't respond. She just stood there watching. It sent a chill down my spine, and I retreated inside. And then there were the noises. At first, I thought I was imagining them, odd scraping sounds in the dead of the night, heavy thuds, and what sounded like low murmurs. I wasn't the only one who had heard them. My neighbor across the street, Ms. Kowalski, mentioned it one morning while we were collecting our mail. "Have you heard those noises from the Simons' house? It's like they're dragging furniture around at all hours," she said, shaking her head. "Strange folks, those Simons." I nodded, relieved that I wasn't alone in my suspicions. We both laughed it off, but unease lingered. Things escalated when pets started disappearing. First, it was the Johnsons' cat, Muffin, and then the Cranes' dog, Rex. The neighborhood buzzed with concern and suspicion. I kept a close eye on my own cat, Whiskers, making sure that she didn't stray too far from home. One evening, I was out for a walk when I saw Mr. Simon in the backyard digging. The yard was already dotted with several freshly dug holes. I couldn't help but feel curiosity and fear. What was he burying? I decided to confront him, but as I approached, he stopped digging and turned to look at me, his expression unreadable in the twilight. "Good evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Evening," he replied curtly, wiping his brow with a dirty sleeve. "What are you digging for?" I asked, attempting a casual tone. "Gardening. Planning to plant some new trees," he said with a flat tone. I nodded, pretending to believe him, but the unease grew. That night, I barely slept, haunted by images of those holes and what might be buried in them. A few days later, Whiskers went missing. I searched everywhere, calling her name until my throat was hoarse. I couldn't shake the feeling that the Simons had something to do with it. Desperation drove me to a reckless decision. In the dead of the night, I snuck into their backyard. It was a full moon, and it was casting that eerie glow over the garden. I approached one of the holes and started digging. My heart pounded in my chest, and fear and adrenaline making my hands tremble. After a few moments, I unearthed a small blood-stained collar. It was Whiskers. I was so engrossed in my grim discovery that I didn't hear Mr. Simon's approach. His hand clamped down on my shoulder, and I spun around, a scream launched in my throat. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. My mind raced, trying to find an excuse, but I could only stammer incoherently. He stared at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something almost human in his eyes, but it vanished quickly. "Stay out of my yard," he said, his grip tightening painfully before he released me. I stumbled back, my pulse roaring in my ears. "Next time you won't be so lucky." I fled, clutching Whiskers' collar to my chest. I locked all my doors and windows, my mind a whirlwind of fear and grief. I called the police the next day, but they found no evidence of foul play. The Simons continued their strange, unsettling existence, and I lived in constant fear, always watching my back. Months passed, and a few more pets disappeared. The neighborhood seemed to shrink away from the Simons' house, a black hole of dread and unanswered questions. I never found out what they were really up to, but I moved away as soon as I could, unable to bear the weight of their presence any longer. Now, years later, I still dream of that night, of the holes in the ground and the cold, unfeeling eyes of Mr. Simons. I'll never forget the terror that gripped our once peaceful neighborhood. That darkness that seemed to seep into the very soil, turning our suburban paradise straight into a nightmare. Hello, dear people of Reddit. I would like to share a creepy story of mine that has been bugging and making me paranoid for quite some time now. Just to clarify, I am a male, and this happened to me when I was 16 in May. It was just another regular day at school. I had just exited my bus and began walking home. The path's not that long, so it only takes me about 12 minutes to get home. I kept walking as usual, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. At some point, there is a very narrow road that leads between two buildings, so cars have to squeeze between them. I always walk on the edge of the road so the cars can easily pass me. There was this one car that I hadn't seen around my area before. I didn't see it, I just heard it behind me. As usual, I moved to the right side of the road so the car could pass. It did not. And that has happened before, so I thought the driver was just being careful since you could damage your car fairly easy. Again, there was a small opening, and I moved to the right, clearly signaling with my body language to the driver that he could pass me. He did not. He was just slowly driving behind me. At that point, I started getting paranoid. Something like this had never happened to me before, and the driver or the people in the car clearly wanted something from me. Just to clarify, there wasn't a single other person or car nearby. I quickened my pace. I eventually exited the narrow road and came upon an opening. It's possible to either turn left or right, but drivers could also turn around on the same road and go back the way they came. I walked on the right road, and at that point, I heard a shout behind me. It was a male voice, and he said, "Hey!" in an angry and rude voice. I did not turn around. I just kept speed walking. The weirdest thing came next. The car had turned around and driven back to the narrow road. I couldn't see his registration number because he drove off too quickly, nor did I ever see him again. I kept looking back because I didn't want him to know where I live. There could have been many different possibilities. Maybe he was a friend of mine and just wanted to say hello, but if he was, he would not have shouted at me like that. Another theory is that he wanted to ask me for directions. And that has happened to me before, but people were always very friendly. I want to have this one as an actual explanation. On a darker note, that could have been an attempted robbery, or even worse, a kidnapping. I don't know. Am I being paranoid? I just want to find a good explanation for this. I've always had a soft spot for older people, due to a great relationship with both of my grandmas, and I never even minded, even as a kid, helping her older neighbors screw in a new light bulb that they couldn't reach. Not wanting to climb up on a step stool and lifting things that, to me, were light as a feather, and so on. I learned they always had stories of their lives that I found interesting, like pages from a forgotten book. I'm still that way, and the older I get, the fewer of them are around. So I have this neighbor just down the street. A few nights ago, after she'd settled into bed, this scratching on her window, followed by a gentle knock, scared her badly. She'd recently lost her husband and hasn't lived alone, ever. I'm in the security business and told her, as I will all of you, my friends, the first scratch on that window glass makes dogs react, so they know if they are in the house. But people sleeping rarely can hear it. And then the light knocking is to test if you are asleep, so they can sneak into the house's kitchen or bathrooms and freely walk around, though you set your security system. Your motion sensors are turned off on stay, so only the door and any window contacts remain active. But sadly, A huge company only places a contact on the doors, so all they really want is your monitoring, but your perimeter is not really protected. I did not install her system, but I informed her of these things, saying to call me if they did this again. I could literally just walk right over there. And first, we'd heard a side door knock when I was sitting with her this past Halloween, so she wouldn't feel alone or scared. It was right as it was way too late for kids to come by, and I was about to go on home. Then the hand grasped her security door handle, jiggling it right and then left, making a distinct noise. They had tried that door. Fast forward a week ago, and there was a pretty loud knocking at her middle bedroom, at the back window near the kitchen. So I got that call. Then, 3 nights ago, there was another knock on her bedroom window, and she was very freaked out. So, tonight, I placed percussion, or glass break detectors for her, and I guess we shall see. It was 2007, and I was 13. The new SmackDown vs. Raw WWE game had just come out, and I went into my small town on a Sunday morning to purchase it. After purchasing the game, I was in awe of the cover and the synopsis on the back of the game, so I sat on a bench to read it and take in the excitement of buying a new game. I lived in a small market town in England, so Sundays were often very quiet. While sitting on the bench, I looked over to the bus stop across the road and noticed a strange-looking, scraggly man walking towards me. I was a bit nervous seeing this because, although I was 13 or 14, I looked about 11, as I was very small. On his approach, he asked me, "What's that you're holding?" I explained it was my new game, and I then said, "Look, I need to go. My brother's waiting for me in the mall." Although he wasn't, I felt that I needed to say this. As I walked off, the man began to follow me, asking me my name and my age. I replied, Lee, which is a fake name, and told him my age. On entering the mall, I started walking quicker and quicker, but I didn't want to start running as, for some reason, I wanted to save face. He kept asking if I had a girlfriend, and as he got closer, I noticed he had a scar down his face and lots of jewelry on. To his question, I responded yes, as I thought that it may put him off if he knew I had a girlfriend. I then ran into a shop in the mall and started flicking through the magazines, but he persisted with the questions. I then got up the courage to run as fast as I could. He began to chase, but I got away. When I got home, I didn't tell my parents. I just went upstairs and played my game. But later that day, I did tell my mom. She called the police immediately. I then had to go to a police station local to myself and tell them what happened, and pick him out of a number of photos the police had on a laptop. Apparently, this man had kidnapped and sexually assaulted many young boys. I was lucky enough, however, to escape. I later found out that he was given 8 years in prison after a couple of boys he assaulted came forward. However, my evidence was not enough. Hey all, I wanted to share a recent experience. I think it's possible that I was being paranoid or overthinking, but either way, it made my spidey senses tingle, and I'm a big believer in trusting your gut. I, 31, female, was recently visiting Amsterdam and had been traveling solo, so mostly seeing some museums and landmarks during the day. I visited a museum in the red light district during the daytime, so it was mostly filled with tourists. Despite that, I'd felt very safe walking around. I still tried to stay pretty alert to avoid pickpocketing, and also since I'd been clearly traveling alone. While I was in one of the rooms in the museum, I accidentally made eye contact with this older, maybe 50-ish man a few times. You know when you're looking around the room and it happens? Well, that just kept happening. Maybe 4 or 5 times. To the point where I started to get a little squicked out that I wasn't imagining it. And so I stayed in the room even longer than I would have, reading all the signs and entries before moving on, not making more eye contact, thinking that he'd of course continue to the next room. Well, he didn't. When I finally moved on to the next room, shocker, so did he. I did the same thing, taking my time to go through all the exhibits in the room, waiting for him to proceed without me. When that didn't happen, I actually regressed back into the previous room to reread the items in there. Again, just thinking that he would move on and then I could relax and enjoy the museum. So, now I go back into the next room, thinking surely he will be gone. And he's not. And we make eye contact again. Crap. I just moved forward to the next room, and so does he, right after me. At this point, I'm kind of freaking out internally. I'm alone and creeped out, but he hasn't really done anything to me, you know? I continue to read the signs in the room, and I notice that he moves into the next room, without me. I'm initially pumped, but as I'm moving around the room between the signs, I can see him standing right by the entrance to the room that I would be entering next. Just standing there. It's hard to explain, but he had turned around, and I managed to end up in a corner of my room where there was no way for him to see me from his vantage point. So I stayed there extra long reading the entry. After a few minutes, he actually came back into the room that I was in, and immediately looked over at me again, making eye contact. That was enough for me. At that point, he could probably tell, I think, that I was very aware of him, and it seemed to me that he tried to play it off nonchalantly that he had re-entered the room. And so he walked over to some of the other signs on the opposite wall. I took that chance to progress through the museum, lose myself in the other groups ahead, and exit as quickly as possible, looking back to make sure he wasn't following me. I am glad that nothing happened, and that I wasn't followed, but I'm also a little bummed that I didn't actually get to enjoy the museum, and missed out on a lot of it. I live in Louisville, Kentucky, which is world famous for the Kentucky Derby. This year was the 150th run for the Roses. We have races of all different kinds leading up to it, from the hot air balloon race, which is really colorful and beautiful to see, and even a hospital bed race and rat race, an old steamboat race, and the couple of weeks leading up to the Derby include many festivities, including a parade and fireworks and the Blue Angels, and an awesome air show, even music and parties. In 1987, I was working at 2 jobs at that time. One was in a hospital in the lab as a phlebotomist. One was in a shoe department of a large store. I was also taking a college class at this time, and in each of these venues I was able to join in the fun and could draw a derby horse from the pot. Meaning names of horses were written out, and you could draw one out if you paid $2, and the more people in the group the better, because that pot would swell. I've always had things happen to me, like premonitions and dreams, or knowing something that I really had no way of knowing. And this derby, years back, I knew which horse would win. At that time, there were no online betting, bookies were illegal, and you had to go to the track yourself to make a bet, or know someone to place it for you who was going. Or just win a little in a jackpot. But in those, you paid your $2 and just drew a slip of paper out of a hat. You could not request a certain horse. More and more, I knew who would win, but everyone always gives odds, tips, and commentary, so no one ever listens, and someone saying they really do know who will win means nothing at all. Everyone just brushes you off. I ran into a person I knew and was so excited because she and her husband, both doctors, were going to the Derbies, so I told her. But I'd say she likely ignored me, or I'd have sure heard all about it. The horse did the unthinkable and started off fast, going the full mile and a quarter without tiring, sailing past all the opposition until the very end, and usually if they break leading, they are quickly at the back of the pack. The horse had incredible odds. A $2 bet would earn about $330. But I had instead simply drawn out of three $2 jackpots a random horse's name. Alashiba, Alashiba, and, Alashiba. Wow. I won around $100 for $6, and it became a Triple Crown win of 3 consecutive races afterwards. I felt like the old Greek mythological character, Cassandra, and the prophetess that nobody ever believed. Hey there. I work 8-hour days restoring historical artifacts, and I have an AirPod in consuming episodes of your podcast throughout weeks at a time. I'm loving this discovery. Just a quick aside, that is an awesome job, just saying. Here is my story. I have no clue how to categorize it, but in my short 22 years of life thus far, I have no clue what I saw or how to explain it. For context, my friends and I are avid disc golfers. We have been for 6 years and counting. Thus, every summer, we take a trip up to northern Michigan to play some of the best courses the state has to offer. During this particular summer, I believe my 2 friends, both named Jack, and I were 18 years old. We were on the second to last day of our trip, and we had found a relatively unknown course deep in the woods, about 2.5 hours from where we were staying. Naturally, we wanted to check it out, as we drove down country roads deep into farmland, and eventually a thick forest, and civilization became a distant memory. By the time we had gotten 2 hours into the drive, we hadn't seen a property or even another car for at least an hour. At this point, 2-lane county roads had whittled down into a narrow 1-lane dirt road that didn't even allow enough space for 2 cars to pass. Knowing that there was absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing for miles upon miles, in the way of evidence of human life, or even a vacation home, is big for the context of what happened next. We were using Apple Maps, and the little Siri voice told us, "You have arrived at your destination." We had overshot whatever entrance we were intended to use, so we did a less than graceful 5-point turn to pivot ourselves in the opposite direction. To our surprise, there was definitely not a disc golf course anywhere nearby. Instead, we sat on the side of the road, peering out the car windows into a small overgrown field, which was approximately the size of half of a football field, maybe slightly smaller. There really wasn't anything special about the field. It was full of old, rusted-out farming equipment, tractor attachments, etc. I'd call this field an ancient junkyard, long taken over by nature. Assuming that we were in the wrong place, as we hadn't seen a single house or car for hours, we did a careful scan of the area looking for any signs indicating an opening to the course. My friends were looking on Google, and my eyes were stuck to the field. At this point, and I swear to God, I am fully sane, a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, emerged from the back of some rusted-out equipment at the back of the field. I'll never forget what she was wearing. Purple, maybe linen pajamas, and a matching set. Nothing you would see a toddler wearing in the modern day. I was like, okay, what the hell is this? There was no adult, or house, or car to be found. Just this little kid, alone, perusing the equipment at the back of the field facing opposite to us. At this point, my shock had spread to my two friends who were now staring intently at the same thing as me, confirming my sanity. We didn't speak, just stared, wondering if we should go and check on her. While we stared at the girl who seemed to not notice we were there, she pivoted and turned in our direction, facing our car parked maybe 100 feet away. At this point, we noped out. My friend Jack kicked his Buick into top gear and we absolutely flew out of there. We had seen Texas Chainsaw, so we figured nothing good could come out of investigating. Now, perhaps there was an adult somewhere there, or a house deep into the woods where she had come from. Or maybe this was some sort of bait. Really? I'm glad not to know. We still tell this story to everyone we know, and I think about it often. I hope you enjoyed, and this is completely true. My mother had passed, and she had this key ring that she'd gotten years back that we teased looked like a jailer's ring. It was all gold and brass, and you could wear it like a bracelet. It had a definite and distinctive sound. I, too, have a lot of keys myself. Anyway, Mother was gone. My sister lived about 10 minutes away. My father remained with us 4 more years. They were our best friends, guides, and confidants. One night, a fierce Kentucky lightning storm whipped up. I took my father into our bathroom for safety. The only window was small and sandwiched between the houses, and safer than any other area. It had plumbing, which is protective, and tile walls, and a really heavy-duty cast-iron fused to porcelain bathtub, which I placed him in with a plastic shower chair. I had Dante, my ragdoll cat, which is half Siamese and half Himalayan, and so docile and gorgeous. I buckled a harness securely onto him with the leash, and I sat on the toilet, having closed up every bedroom door in our hallway and the bathroom door to shield us from any flying glass, since the TV predicted a tornado. We talked and listened to booming like we had never experienced. It crashed one big roar, and my cat shot out of his now empty harness, leaving my arm wrapped in a leash dangling from the empty harness. Soon, my sister called asking where I was. "We're in the bathroom," I informed her. "Did you just come here?" she asked urgently. No, of course not. She had experienced going into her basement where she sat at an old dining room table with a lit candle, flashlight, and radio on it, and she had her iPhone. She had a nearby clock and an old TV nearby, but it was off. She didn't want to turn on the radio either, since it might attract lightning. She sat in silence with her big Maine Coon cat, Sam. Suddenly, she heard her garage door open and then close, and then a car door slam with the jingling of keys, and then the door connecting the garage to the kitchen, which was on the other side of the wall from her closed basement door. We had a habit when coming into the house to announce ourselves. "I'm here," which she clearly heard, thinking, why was I there and not with our father? She called out that she was in the basement and wanted to find out what was going on. Why was I there, and where was our father? She came up the steps to see no one. Nothing. No car in her garage, and then it hit her. My voice and my mother's are almost identical. But if it wasn't me jingling my roll of keys calling out in my voice, then it was my mother's. But she was gone. So as I insisted on the phone that I'd been home from work for hours, helping my dad barricade from the storm, Mother had gone to be with her. This is a story from when I was in college up in Sudbury, Ontario many years ago. I lived in a house just off campus with a few roommates, in a bungalow that was divided into two apartments. The landlord and one girl lived upstairs, which she rented a bedroom, and I lived downstairs with my boyfriend and one of his best friends. Every one of us experienced weird things while living there, all of which were quite innocent. Things like the shower running but nobody turning it on, footsteps when nobody was around, the VCR turning on and clicking around by itself, which they used to do, but sometimes it seemed like a little extra, and sometimes there was doors shutting. Nothing too much, but enough to make you go, and get a little creeped out. But there was this one time that got me turning all the lights on. It isn't as scary as some stories that come in, but creepy all the same. I stayed at home studying one week as I had a test coming up, and my roommates were all out partying. The girl that lived upstairs was away that weekend as well, and had asked me to keep an eye and ear open to make sure nobody came into her room, as she had some valuables in there, and the landlord was not there either. Most likely at his girlfriend's house, as he spent a good bit of time there on the regular. So, all was quiet while I was studying, when I hear the upstairs front door that leads outdoors open and shut. I assume it's my landlord and go back to studying, keeping one ear open since the girl upstairs had asked me to. Then I hear footsteps across the floor. Now, just a little info about this house. It was a bit older, and so the floor always creaked when the people upstairs walked around. These footsteps did not create creaking, which now got my full attention. As I sat there and was now listening intently, I started to hear what sounded like a large box or something being pushed across the floor, along with more creak-free footsteps. I got goosebumps. I decided to check upstairs to see if anyone was home, so I went up the small flight of stairs to check the door. It was locked, and all the lights were off. The dividing door was a glass one with a white set of shears for privacy, so it was easy to see if any lights were on, even if in another room. Nobody appeared to be home. Okay, I thought, so I decided to go downstairs and continue studying. Weirded out, but not entirely surprised, since we do regularly experience things. Nonetheless, the lights all were not on. A few minutes later, I heard more boxes being pushed around, more footsteps minus the creaking, and then the front door open and shut. At this point, I'm super curious. I need to see what's up. Since I was in Sudbury, and we had just had about 2 feet or so of fresh powder snowfall, I decided to go out to the driveway to see who or what might be there. To my surprise, there was not a track up the driveway, walkway, or steps up to the door. Not a tire track, and not even a step at the foot of the driveway. There was no trace of anything. The lights stayed on until my roommates got home and I filled them in on the events they missed out on. Nobody was really surprised, but we still decided to confront the landlord. He told me that the house was absolutely haunted, but he's not advertising that. The previous owners had apparently died in the bathtub, and they weren't found for 3 days, and they've been puttering around the house ever since. I regularly have these weird, seemingly apocalyptic dreams. I'm walking through a place that I feel like I know, but it's all kind of bombed out. I can see tall buildings where the exterior walls are all open. People have, like, blankets or tapestries hanging for privacy, but they're living very high up. In one of these dreams, I went to an amphitheater of sorts. It looked over a body of water. There were metal strings crisscrossed over openings of the amphitheater that looked at the water. There were a lot of people seated in this theater. Suddenly, fish started jumping out of the water and impaling themselves on these metal strings as the crowd cheered. In my dream, I wasn't interested in the show, so I left. I walked back out to escape of large broken rocks and train tracks in the background. All I wanted was to get home, but I knew it was a long way from home, too far to walk. But it seemed like the infrastructure of the city was gone and there was no way for me to get an Uber or a train or anything to get home. It seemed like something big and terrible had happened a while ago, and people were just dealing with it. But I felt lost and could not find my way home. I went to several of these apartments in the tall buildings with the blankets hanging over the exterior. They all seemed strangely familiar, but not. I remember looking out to the horizon and just seeing train tracks with train cars, but they weren't hooked to anything. What do you guys think this means? Maybe this isn't so much creepy to the general public, but it definitely made me nervous at the time. When I was 12 years old, in 2007, I was home alone babysitting with my two younger siblings while my parents were out at an event. It was summertime, so it stayed light out for a while into the evening. Just as it was starting to get dark, I went to the kitchen to make a bowl of popcorn to watch a movie with my brother and sister. When I looked out the kitchen window, I saw that there was a car parked hiding in the tree line of our yard. For context, we live in a fairly rural place, and we rarely had people out our direction unless they lived down our gravel road. And we knew our neighbors' cars. This was a junky beater and the license plate had been taped over. It was not one of our neighbors. I was a kid who was pretty aware of my surroundings, and I decided to step back from the big kitchen window and go into the dark entryway hall to get a better look. There was just a single man sitting in it, staring directly at the house, with the lights off. Immediately, I locked the front and back door. I told my little brother and sister calmly to play in their rooms and to not come out until I came and got them for the movie night. I then went back to the kitchen to get my phone to call my mom, but she didn't answer. I watched him through the curtains sit in the dark tree line and just stare at the house for what felt like ages. Finally, someone drove down our road, and their headlights reflected off of the car. He started the engine, drove out of the trees, and booked it down the gravel. I was still very nervous and tried calling my mom again. No answer. So, for the rest of the time, I just played with my siblings in their room with the door shut and curtains pulled until my parents came home later that night. When I tried telling my parents what happened, they were convinced I was making it up, and that I was just being a dramatic kid. I swore up and down that I saw this car with blackened out plates in the tree line, and they weren't interested at all. I know I saw it, but I'm the only one who did. Maybe it was just a random guy who didn't know there were 3 young kids home alone, hiding for some reason, but I'm still glad that I locked all the doors. 20 years ago, when I was just a baby, my family made a big move from a small town to a bustling city. We found a house that seemed perfect, spacious, airy, and just the right amount of charm. For the first few days, everything was great. We settled in, began to feel at home, but then strange things started happening. It started with my uncle. One night he was sleeping alone in his room when he woke up suddenly. The fan had turned off, and he felt someone tugging at his blanket. Startled, he sat up and looked around, but there was no one there. He rushed out to check on the rest of us, only to find everyone fast asleep. Then there was my granny. She was taking a bath one morning when she felt a strange sensation. Someone was blowing air into her ears. She felt a chill breeze even though there are no windows in the bathroom. She quickly finished her bath and told us what happened, but we didn't know what to make of it. My mom had her own eerie experience. She was in the kitchen cooking dinner when she heard someone call her name. She turned around expecting to see one of us, but there was no one there. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The most unsettling part of the house was a long, narrow passage that connected the living room to the bedrooms. Frequently, we would see shadows moving down the passage, even when we were all together in the living room. It became a regular occurrence, and we started to avoid the passage as much as possible. Living in that house was becoming unbearable. The constant sense of unease and the strange occurrences were taking a toll on us. We finally decided that we couldn't stay out there any longer. After just 6 months, we packed up and moved out. Before we left, my mom went to see the owner of the house one last time. On our way back, some neighbors called out to her, and they asked if she finally left that house. When she said yes, they looked at each other with relief and told her something that sent chills down her spine. The house was known to be haunted. A young girl had hanged herself in one of the rooms years ago, and ever since, strange things have been happening to anyone who lived there. And they couldn't tell her because the owner had begged them not to, so they couldn't do much. Another eerie part was that none of the neighbors used to talk to us, which we found weird, but we were also not much of the extroverted types personally, so we brushed it off. My mom was shocked and scared by the revelation. She rushed back home and told us what she had learned. We were all stunned and terrified. It was hard to believe that we had been living in a haunted house for 6 months without knowing it. We thanked God that we had managed to get out of there safely. Even now, when we talk about those 6 months, we can't help but feel a shiver run down our spines. The memories of that house and the strange things that happened there will stay with us forever. Even though I was a few months old, my family keeps on telling me this story that has made it memorable for me. Hey Raven, longtime listener, first time poster. Recently there was a post regarding creepy coworkers reminding me that I had a creepy coworker, and I could share that story since I feel like the rest of my stories are quite frankly too short to share. When I was 15, I needed to get a job. This was because I had lost my parents' very expensive camera. I had gone to several places to try to get a job, and I was too young for most of them, even though online it was a different story. I ended up getting a job at a popular pizza place near my home. It didn't pay much, but it was something. Well, I worked there for a couple of months before they introduced a guy named Jesus to the team. He was a smaller Hispanic man, still taller than me, as my height and body build often made people think I was significantly younger than I was, along with my mannerisms regarding how I treat people. I'm a very trusting person. As long as I'm not given any reason not to trust you, I will trust you. Jesus seemed to have an interest in me right from the get-go, which I didn't much care. It wasn't a big deal, and I had had plenty of pursuers before. About 3 days before we met, Jesus approached me. "Hey, I think you're really cute. Can I have your number and perhaps go on a date with you?" Well, my family had a rule that I couldn't date until I was 16, as it was a part of our religious beliefs. I would be turning 16 in about a month, so my response was, "My family has a rule that I can't date until I'm 16. I turned 16 on April 5th. How old are you?" Jesus said, "Oh, I'm 17. I'll be turning 18 about a week after you turn 16. Age gaps have never bothered me, as long as they were small enough, though the legality of dating an adult did bother me. So I offered him my number and said that we could probably go on one date, and that was it. A couple of days later, I was sitting in class when I got a text from Jesus. He asked what I was doing, so I explained that I was in class. We went back and forth for a bit, him revealing that he wasn't in school anymore and me just being confused. A lot of the things he said didn't add up to the age he said he was. So I brushed it aside as high school dropout, as they are rather common. It wasn't until he called me baby that my red flags started flying. I felt rather offended even. He had known me for what, 2 weeks? And only talked to me in person twice, and he already was calling me baby? I went off on him, saying how sketchy it was for him to be acting how he was. Flirting with the 15-year-old even though he knew he was turning 18 soon, even if that was the truth. Which it wasn't, as minors in my workplace always had an M next to their name and Jesus did not. And how I was not going to go by baby to anyone I had just met. He stopped contacting me and my mom called me in later that night, as I had forgotten to tell her, but it was a habit of hers to make sure I wasn't talking to any bad people. She praised me for taking the action I did, and contacted my boss about Jesus. My boss immediately said that if he made any further advances, to tell him and they would talk to the police if necessary. I never did see Jesus again, and I hope that other young girls are able to be just as sharp as I was. I have a couple of computers in the office next to my bedroom, but they were turned off, as were the radio and TV. I was taking a blouse out of my closet one morning to put on, and suddenly, all close up to my right ear, like someone way too close to you, I heard the old French song that, honestly, I've not even heard since childhood a couple of times. I've never even taken a French class, but right into my ear I heard a female voice clear and strong sing 2 or 3 verses of this song, all in perfect French. I didn't recognize a word of it, so I couldn't just imagine it. It was nuts. I kept thinking surely it must be coming out of my office from the computer somehow. If you needed heightened computer security, could someone hack into mine, or could I pick up something next door that they were doing? I don't know, but that can't explain it talking right into my ear. It was weird as heck. You should always bless your antiques. I recall having gone shopping a lot during the day and had several of these plastic bags in my bedroom, because before bed, I wanted to look at everything I'd found. I was in a fine and normal mood, but as soon as I'd turn off my light, I could just make out those bags on the nearby chair. And suddenly I heard all of this intense rustling and crinkling and balling them up, rolling them shut, and fiddling around with them like crazy. And I became scared to death the longer someone or something continued doing this. I didn't have a cat anymore at that point, which could have sounded that way. No one was there, but it sounded like a human being searching through the 5 or so bags. The feeling was tangible in the room, is all I can tell you. And it grew more and more petrifying. I wish I knew where these things came from, as I do shop in peddlers' malls or antique stores sometimes, and I do have an antique secretary desk, which is a fold-down desk that young ladies used to receive as a gift from family around the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And their wood frame, glass doors house bookshelves. I got it in a haunted antique store one time. The doors will always open, and you cannot make them stay closed. Also, one day, as I was placing something into it, out fell an old card, which I looked at. It was a 1940s calendar, of all things, smaller than a playing card, and it had a black and white photo of a bank that had advertised. It was weird. This story is something my partner experienced with her son. Her son, 7 at the time, is a deep sleeper. It takes a lot to wake him up. One night she was in the living room and her son called out to her. She asked him what was wrong and he told her that something scared him. She brought him to the living room to sleep next to her on the couch, and then asked what had scared him. "The face in my room," he said. Obviously, she was creeped out and asked what he meant. He said that a shadowy face was floating at the edge of his bed when he woke up. At first, he laughed because it was making a funny face, but then it widened its grin and started gnashing its teeth. Oh, and it had glowing eyes. What the hell? She asked him if it was a dream, and he insisted that it was real. She comforted him, telling him that that must have been scary, and eventually got him back to bed. An hour later, he woke up on the couch and yelled again, saying the face was back. She couldn't see it, but asked where it was. Insistently, he said, "It's right there, Mom. Right there," and pointed to a spot behind the corner of the couch. She walked over and he said, "It moved," and told her that it was now by the middle of the living room. She still couldn't see it, but unlike many parents, she didn't brush him off. Instead, she said, "Hey, I don't know what you are or why you're here, but you're scaring my son and I need you to stop." After she said that, her son said that Mr. Gnashing Teeth moved out of the living room and went down the basement stairs. She closed the door, her son fell back asleep, and that was that. I'm very happy to say that they don't live there anymore. Although, at their new place, their dog likes to stare at a blank spot on the wall, so maybe I'll have a new story for you someday.